Once they had her pinned down, the police officers and ambulance attendants agreed that an exorcist would do her more good than a hospital. The medium agreed to come back to Jézanne's apartment to exorcise poor Vanessa.
So the medium arrived and they moved her into the kitchen with the medium. I called my supervisor to let him know what was happening. And while I was talking to my supervisor, the medium was performing the exorcism in the kitchen, so I didn't actually see what she did. But I did ask my supervisor to pray for us. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I was so messed up by what I had felt that it seemed important for someone to be praying for us.
It took many hours of prayer before Vanessa came to her senses. As far as Jézanne Desfaits was concerned, this time the message was clear. She had to move. In a story like Jézanne Desfaits, there's a fine line between haunting and possession. In cases like this, it's sometimes difficult to separate the real phenomena from those fed by the imagination and desires of the individuals who see them. Perhaps Vanessa had certain expectations in mind before going to Jézanne's apartment. Perhaps she expected to see something unusual happen. Was she the victim of an unknown entity or her own imagination? Is there any way of knowing for sure? In 1996, after her difficult birth, Annick Laprat had only one wish: to see her daughter. But her exhilaration was about to turn into an incredible nightmare.
When she was first born, Marie-Claude cried a lot. Her nasal passage was blocked, so the doctors took care of it. She cried all night long. Some of my family was visiting. Around midnight, my guests had left and I was all alone in my hospital room. I decided that I wanted to see her for some quiet mother-daughter time. I asked the nurses to bring her to me, which they did. Marie-Claude was sleeping, so I spoke to her quietly. Then she opened her eyes, and what I saw was a cold, empty look, and her pupils were very dilated.
Annick thought she must be imagining things, suffering from some sort of postnatal shock.
For the first 2 years of her life, Marie-Claude cried a lot. Naturally, there were calm periods, but in general, she was a crybaby.
When the child reached the age of 2, she continued to display abnormal behavior. She was hyperactive. Doctors told the parents that the young girl was probably suffering from a multiple personality disorder. They recommended that the child see a psychiatrist, but the wait seemed endless.
At one point, Marie-Claude was chasing her brother, and we could see that she wanted to hurt him. So I sent her to her room, and we could hear sounds, a real loud bing, bang, boom. And I held the door shut. Then the noises stopped, and Marie-Claude calmed down. Usually she would calm down after a temper tantrum, and then she would go to sleep. When I opened the door, Marie-Claude was sitting against the wall. She wasn't sleeping, she was drawing on the wall with her own blood. She turned and looked at us and began to laugh. I didn't think my daughter was herself at that moment.
With no help from traditional medicine, Annick Laprat turned to an osteopath that she knew.
For 8 months, she received treatments from an osteopath, and we could see a difference in her, but the temper tantrums persisted. The osteopath asked me if I was open-minded and said she knew someone named Michael who worked with energy who might be able to help. So we set up an appointment with Michael because we didn't have anything to lose. We were still on the waiting list to see a psychiatrist. When we saw Michael for the first time, Marie-Claude was with me, so he observed her and asked a few questions. Then he said that there were two entities in Mary Claude's energy field. He suggested that we perform a ritual to release those entities and to fully incarnate Mary Claude's soul. Obviously, we were quite shocked to receive news like this. But again, we had nothing to lose. No drugs were involved, so there was no risk to her health. And I decided to go for it.
A release ritual was organized, during which Michael said prayers and ordered the entities to leave the child's body.
At one point, Michael ordered the entities to leave Mary Claude's energy field. And I felt like a current pass through me. It only lasted a second or two. It felt as if someone was pressing on my chest, and I had difficulty breathing. I panicked for a moment and then looked at Michael, and he was looking at me. Then he repeated the order for the entities to leave. When I fully came back to my senses, I noticed that Mary Claude was soaked in sweat, and her cheeks were bright red, but she was also peaceful and calm.
Practically overnight, Marie-Claude's behavior changed. She was now calmer, and her angry outbursts were gone. There was no doubt in Annick Laprat's mind that her daughter had genuinely been released from evil forces trying to invade her body. Annick Laprat's story is surprising. The victim was a mere infant, so it was hard to accuse her of having imagined her symptoms. And the young mother's approach was equally surprising, choosing to expose her daughter to an alternative technique that proved to be highly effective. The spiritual approach versus the medical approach. Now there's an interesting debate.
In his famous work entitled The Spirit's Book, Allan Kardec, the father of Spiritism, speaks of entities that are capable of insinuating themselves into a person's mind and influencing their behavior. Kardec does not mention possession per se, but he does mention a form of spiritual parasite. I would say that even though Kardec lived more than a century ago, his interpretation of the possession phenomenon has always been supported by individuals interested in spiritism or paranormal phenomena, like the people who intervened in the cases of Jézanne Desfaits and Annick Laprat. Obviously, those who oppose this theory, particularly the medical community, like to point out that Allan Kardec died in 1869. And back then, very little was known about major psychological pathologies. In their opinion, believing that spirits can take possession of an individual and influence their behavior is going back to the Dark Ages. Clearly, no one from the medical community would dare defend this theory. However, it's a bit crazy, since more and more people, including therapists, are openly accepting the theory of possession as a possible alternative to behavioral problems.
Adam Crabtree, one of Toronto's best-known psychotherapists, also thinks that disincarnate spirits may be at the root of some behavioral problems. In his book Multiple Man, Crabtree presents many cases that he himself handled that defy conventional psychiatric prognosis. One case dealt with a young woman who claimed to be possessed by the spirit of an unknown entity. When he placed his patient under hypnosis, Crabtree was able to carry on a conversation with this invisible intruder.